The Dark Phoenix Saga is one of the most legendary comic book storylines ever told. But today, I want to talk about the extremely messy behind-the-scenes events that writer Chris Claremont had to navigate through. With suggested plot points such as making Jean, quote, mentally retarded, suggestions of a life of torture for her, and issues of sexism when it came to showing just how powerful the Phoenix was, it is amazing that the Dark Phoenix Saga ended up being as good as what it is. In July 2012, an article was published on the website uncannyxmen.net. The article contained a compilation of various interviews with the writer of the Dark Phoenix Saga, Chris Claremont, alongside artists Dave Cockrum and John Byrne. Dave Cockrum being the artist who helped Chris Claremont originally come up with the Phoenix, and John Byrne being the artist who drew for the Phoenix Saga portion of the story. In this interview, Dave begins by stating that he and Chris Claremont wanted to revamp Jean Grey when they started their run on the X-Men book. Dave states that he hated Jean's original costume, and that both him and Chris hated Jean's codename of Marvel Girl, stating that they thought it was a dumb name. This is where the initial inspiration for the Phoenix began, with Cockrum stating, "At some point we thought, well, we're giving her an official rebirth, and Phoenix refers to rebirth, so okay, we'll call her Phoenix." The duo always had the intention of making Phoenix a cosmic hero of sorts, being on the same levels as Thor and Silver Surfer when it comes to power scaling. Our intent was to create an X-Men analog, if you will, to Thor, someone who was essentially the first female cosmic hero. We thought that at the time we could integrate her into the book as well as Thor had been integrated into the Avengers. Marvel editorial, however, had strong issues with this idea. Dave and I liked the idea that we had a female character who was cosmic. No one else did. The initial plan to show the new power of the Phoenix was to have her fight either Thor or Silver Surfer, but Marvel editorial wouldn't allow this, with the at-the-time editor-in-chief Jim Shooter saying, "No female is going to beat Thor or Silver Surfer." Chris and Dave got around this by having Jean fight Firelord, a character who had previously fought Thor to a draw. After being told by Marvel editorial that they weren't allowed to make Jean a cosmic hero, the duo of Chris and Dave decided to cut her power level down to, quote, roughly Storm's level. It is about this time that artist John Byrne took over the book from Dave Cockrum as the artist of the X-Men title. Unlike Chris and Dave, John was not a fan of the Phoenix. I didn't like Phoenix since the word go, because she instantly made the rest of the X-Men fifth wheels, you know? And she wasn't even an X-Man. Much as I'd prefer to have it a different way, this is why Phoenix isn't on the cover or in the title logo, is that in the opinion of Roger Stern and John Byrne, she isn't an X-Man. John's dislike towards the Phoenix is actually what led to the Dark Phoenix Saga in the first place. John likes Jean. He did not like Phoenix. John's antipathy towards Phoenix as a character was one of the primary motivations behind the entire decision to begin a Dark Phoenix storyline and get rid of her, or at least change her in such a way that she would not remain on the team as a Phoenix. It's about this time that the idea of the Dark Phoenix storyline began to be developed, with new X-Men editor Jim Salicrup, Chris, and John all meeting for a lunch to discuss Chris's idea for, quote, a crazy storyline Chris had in mind wherein Phoenix was going to slowly, over the course of many issues, be corrupted by her power and become a great threat. It was also pointed out this time by Jim Shooter that while Marvel had many heroes start out as villains such as Black Widow and Hawkeye, they never had a hero turn bad. It was suggested by Jim that Phoenix should be turned into a villain and permanently become the new Doctor Doom for the X-Men. This idea was liked by Salicrup, and Chris Claremont began to work on what would become the Dark Phoenix storyline. However, during the development process, it was John Byrne who got cold feet. The original intent to turn her into a bad villain got lost with me about 2/3 of the way into the story, when I suddenly started thinking, we're doing this to Jean Grey, with whom I've always been deeply involved. My whole thought was, make Phoenix evil and then suck Phoenix out of Jean. John's initial idea to depower Jean was to mentally de-age her. The logic being that since her powers manifested when she was about 10, Charles Xavier would mentally de-age her to that of a 9-year-old. In this version, Jean would end up living with her parents, described as, quote, essentially retarded. The Phoenix would still be present in this version of Jean and would occasionally pop up, being described as a sort of Jekyll and Hyde situation. Thankfully, Chris Claremont wasn't too fond of this idea. Instead, Chris's idea was that the Phoenix would be destroyed in a battle on the moon, and 3 or 4 issues later, she would turn up as Jean, back to her old apartment with the vibe of, quote, here I am, I'm back, leave me alone, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to hear about it, I'm just going to live my life. We sort of synthesized those ideas, which bubbled down into that we were going to depower her. But she was essentially going to be Jean and was going to live her life and wasn't going to be 9 years old. It was around this time that issue 135 came out. In this issue, the Phoenix destroys a Shi'ar starship, killing hundreds, as well as a nearby inhabited planet, in turn killing billions. What I wanted to do was spend the next 8 issues or so having Jean come to terms with the fact that she can no longer move things by thought, that she is locked inside of her head for the first time in her adult life. At the same time, she has the memories that she had godlike powers, and more importantly, what she did with them. In this version of the story, it would follow a depowered Jean, as she has to live with the knowledge of the terrible act she had committed. Eventually, Magneto would come to learn of this act, and falsely believing he could control the Phoenix, kidnaps Jean and offers to give her powers back. The X-Men would arrive in an attempt to rescue her, and Jean alone with the Phoenix would have to come to a choice. Does she accept this power that she wants with every fibre of her being, knowing that if she takes it, she will probably lose control again because she's not evolved enough, and go on a rampage and kill and maim and destroy? Could I become a god again with all the powers of a god, aware that in the process I may destroy living beings and planets, planetary systems, whatever, in order to survive? Or do I deny it and remain this kind of, what is for her, shadow of a being? And then the idea was that would end on a triumphant note as Jean proved her own heroism. Jean would have ended up denying this power, with Chris describing this decision as the ultimate sacrifice. However, Marvel editorial had issues with this plan, specifically Jim Shooter. When I read X-Men 135 that included this scene in which the Phoenix destroys a Shi'ar starship, killing hundreds, and an inhabited planet, killing billions, curious, I asked Jim Salicrup to show me whatever else was done on the storyline. Shooter recorded in back issue number 29. I discovered that Chris and John had backed down from the idea of Phoenix becoming the X-Men's Doctor Doom. The plot indicated that Phoenix would somehow be mind-wiped and let go, back to living at the mansion, hanging around with Storm and company, sitting at the same table for lunch, etc. Did I have a moral issue with that? Yes. More than that, it was a character issue. Would Storm sit comfortably at a dinner table with someone who had killed billions as if nothing ever happened? Nah. He popped the cork. And that was exactly what we'd been afraid of all along. What I was trying to write in the Phoenix story is a story about forgiveness, about mercy, about how the greatest mass murder in history of the cosmos can, and in some circumstances, should be forgiven. And the difference between Lalange's race, this incredibly old, incredibly mature race that rules a galaxy, and ours, is that hers had the capacity to look at Phoenix or Jean, to judge the situation impartially, and choose the side of forgiveness. And that's why I very specifically said all through every speech Lalandra made relating to Phoenix, Phoenix must die. Phoenix must be neutralized. Phoenix must be dealt with. Because she understood that they were two separate beings, that one could view Phoenix without viewing Jean, that they were bound but not inseparable. It was not that Phoenix was evil. It was just that Jean suddenly found herself coming out of a situation where she had been sucked up into this Black Queen personality, this somewhat cruel, decadent trip. She went directly from that to a situation where her slightest wish, her slightest thought could manifest as a reality. Jim asked Chris to change the ending of the story, as he didn't believe the punishment, or lack thereof, fit the crime. Jim felt that the story wimped out. It ended with her being back with the X-Men, seemingly without much concern on their part about what she had done, which struck me as something out of character for them. Also, it didn't fulfill the original discussion that we had had. He did not want Jean to get away scot-free. The essential given was that he thought Jean had committed 4,430 acts of homicide, first-degree murder, and she was getting away for it with a slap on the wrist. He would not be dissuaded from this view. Shooter wanted Jean punished. He wanted her to suffer. His idea was that she would go to prison, that she would be tortured horribly, that she would be drawn and quartered, whipped, chained drawn and quartered at morning and put back together at night. He wanted the torture of Prometheus, chained to a rock with the eagles ripping her guts out every day, or a reasonable facsimile thereof. Chris and John were not happy about this decision from Jim. The two were thinking about heading into Jim's office and demanding that someone else write issue 137 and 138, saying that they would abide by whatever Jim did, and that they wanted to wash their hands of the matter. Chris stated that at this point, none of this was their fault. Every plot had been cleared by Salicrup. Every script had been cleared by Salicrup, and assumed by Shooter. I was sitting in Shooter's office saying, I told you this, but he didn't remember. Didn't Jim show you the plots? No. Didn't Jim show you the scripts? No. Jim, however, stood by his position, saying that he understood that none of this was their fault, but as editor-in-chief, it was his responsibility to ensure nothing gets printed that reflects a moral position that he did not think Marvel should take, and he felt that this story did just that. He did not feel that we had sufficient foundation for the forgiveness aspect that I was talking about. It was at this time that Lewis Jones had been appointed editor of the X-Men book, effective as of issue 138. Lewis and I sat down and we started putting together X-Men 137, because Salicrup didn't want any part of it. And I was really pissed off at this point and I didn't want to work with him on it anyway. The problem that the team working on the X-Men had was that the next issue had already been drawn. Also, my thought process at the time was that I was not going to have Jean taken to prison. So that meant we'd have a situation where the X-Men are continually trying to rescue her, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, it made no sense. There's a limit to how much John can do in terms of repenciling, because he's got Captain America on his desk. He's got the next X-Men on his desk. We're both pissed, so it eventually comes down to the fact that if anything's going to happen, it's going to happen in the last 5 pages, period. So I'm tossing a number of ideas around in my head. I try a couple out on Louise, and she says they sound fine. I go to Jim Shooter, I try them on him, he says, sounds good to me. But evidently, the only one he heard, or the only one that stayed in his mind, is that Jean dies. Page 29 was meant to be shot of the moon, ship in the foreground, Phoenix effect around the moon. The bird, claws out, wings extended. Bolt of energy just plowing up from the moon through the ship, boom. Panic on the ship. Xavier going, oh god, wake up, my X-Men. X-Men responding, attacking Jean. She and Scott end up getting knocked into the Watcher's house, which were previously established as having weaponry and devices that are beyond the ken of mortal men. Jean and Scott have their scene. The Watcher is standing there in the background, somewhere observing. Jean picks his brain, unbeknownst to him, finds the right weapon, uses it to destroy herself, or to manifest herself on some other plane of existence. Scott is upset, Watcher has a big moment, story ends. Chris states that Jean's corporeal form would have faded away, but it would have been one of the Watcher's devices that did the trick. But as far as Scott is concerned, she would be dead. John, however, ended up going down to Miami with Jim Shooter. It was there that he gave Jim a different breakdown of the last 6 pages. Most importantly being that John felt the Watcher should not be involved at all. Chris states that he and Luis didn't learn about this until the penciling for the issue had already been finished, and because of this, there was nothing they could do about it. Luis was upset that Jim had approved the plot changing without telling her. Jim was very apologetic. He thought John had discussed it with her. John thought Jim had. I was wondering what the fuck was going on. And again, the splash page. That shot of the ship being blown away. It was not what I'd plotted. And more fundamentally, by replacing the Watcher's house with a Kree blaster, then you have to accept, given the history of the blue area of the moon, as outlined by Steve Englehart, then a device constructed by the Kree at the very beginning of their mechanist civilizations, when they were essentially being given everything by the Skrulls, is capable of destroying Dark Phoenix. To me anyway, that stretched the bonds of credibility. And again, the structure of the story as penciled was such that there was no opportunity prior to Jean's death to explain the logic behind it. Which is why you have Scott going, oh, weep, 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 and then you have got those 5 balloons sitting on his head explaining why Jean did what she did. Chris was extremely angry at this, stating that if they had more time, if they had another 2 weeks, they could have sat back and done things properly. At the end of it, there simply wasn't time. Given the fact that we only had 6 pages, given the fact that the next issue was penciled and we couldn't bump it, given the fact that the story had to come to an end, given the fact that we were all furious and all hurt. Chris felt that he was left out on the edge of the limb. He thought about quitting, as the only option he felt he had was to not finish the story. But that wasn't something he was willing to do. I insisted on the solution. It was done brilliantly, if reluctantly, by Chris and John. And that was the issue that propelled the X-Men to the top for, 2 decades? Chris had never been able to let it go. But I actually think that what we ultimately did was better than what we had planned. I think the death of the Phoenix made it a much more powerful story. I don't think it would be the comics icon that everybody still refers to today if we had done what we had originally planned to do. Chris later went on to admit that he does believe that Jim's decision was the correct one in retrospect. And although it upset Chris since he liked Jean a lot as a character, he said later that it became apparent to him that Jim had made the right call, agreeing that everyone has to take responsibility for their actions, especially if you were a superhero. We had stumbled over the absolutely right solution to the story. It was right for the character, right for the book, right for the series, and our decision was that we wanted the story to have an ending. Putting her in prison was not an ending. It was leaving us a giant loose end that we would spend the next 2 years frantically trying to resolve. But we also determined that if she did die, it would be for real. No imaginary story, no back from the dead, no convenient last minute gimmick, she would die. The characters would have to deal with the loss, the readers would have to deal with the loss. You should never assume that just because, for example, Jean Grey was half of the second oldest romantic relationship in the Marvel Universe, because she was the Phoenix, the most powerful female character in comics, that at the end of the climactic battle, she would survive, and she and Scott would somehow live happily ever after, because that's not always the way it happens. But anyway guys, this is the end of the video. If you want to read the article for yourself, I will post a link to it in the description. I've never made a video like this before, so while I am confident I didn't get anything wrong, if I did, please feel free to correct me in the comments below. I totally appreciate that. But yeah, I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you've made it this long, I thank you. That means a lot to me. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.